Welcome to Nexus Extra. This week we've been looking at the violence in the Middle East, and we do hope you've seen our full program. And now we're having a bit of time with Omar Dajani, who is a professor of law at the University of the Pacific and served as legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team from 1999 to 2001 during the peace talks that culminated in the Camp David and Taba rounds of negotiations. He joins us now from a rather interesting location, Brittany in France. Omar, thanks for joining us. Much appreciated. Now, your story is quite interesting. As I say, you participated in those negotiations. Tell us the story of how you got involved in those.
You know, it's funny. I was working for a law firm in Washington, D.C., and one of my law school classmates reached out to me. I'd done some Palestinian advocacy work with him when we were both in law school. And he said, listen, peace talks are about to start. Ehud Barak was expected to be elected Prime Minister of Israel. And the Palestinians need legal assistance. And the UK government, through DFID, has pledged to provide the necessary financial support to make that happen. And so, are you in? He asked. And I said I had to check with my firm. And it's funny because actually my law firm, Sidley & Austin, also employed a guy named Joel Singer, who was the architect of the Oslo Accords. And so the managing partner, in deciding whether to grant my request for a leave, turned to Joel and said, so should we let him do this? And Joel said, oh, yes, I think it's better for the firm to have someone on both sides of this conflict.
Right. And Taba is described by some as the closest the Palestinians and Israelis have ever got to ending the conflict. What was so important about it? What elements of the agreement could act as a model for today?
I think that what was striking about Taba was two things, process and substance. So from a process perspective, bear in mind that this was the eve of the elections that would bring Ariel Sharon to power.
Yeah.
And so there was a recognition that this was a last chance, and
because Sharon was known as an extreme hardliner.
That's right.
Associated with massacres and so on.
Associated with the worst massacres during the Lebanese Civil War, and with very hardline settlement expansion during the time that he was housing minister in the 1980s. So no one had any illusions about what could be achieved with him. And so there was this sense among both Palestinians and Israelis in the negotiations that this was a moment that had to be seized. And so there was a more candid, more searching, and somehow more equitable dynamic during those talks than I'd seen before. So that's on the process side, but I think substantively, there was more of a recognition then than we had certainly seen at Camp David on the part of Israelis to try to meet us halfway, to think in more creative ways about questions like where to draw the border, but how to deal with refugee return. The Israelis there were at least willing, in a way that they hadn't been at Camp David, to discuss the possibility of refugee return. So one hopes that both the climate and the willingness to engage with the full array of issues is something that could be resurrected at some point.
And you didn't quite get it over the line. Ehud Barak pulled out because the elections were coming up. Is that right?
That's right. Literally, the negotiations were suspended. And within a couple of days, as I recall, the elections took place. And so I think it's funny, I was just in a conversation with Yossi Balin, who was also part of the team, part of the Israeli team. And he put it well, I think. He said, I think at Taba was the first time when we touched peace. And I think that that's right. But I also think that Ehud Barak, over the previous 6 months, had done a lot of damage by framing this narrative that there was no Palestinian partner for peace, that the Israeli public really embraced to in a way that I think hastened the demise of the not only the negotiations that were happening there, but the peace process more
Was there an
broadly.
American presence at Taba?
There was not really an American presence at
And did
Taba.
that change the atmosphere in the room?
That's an interesting question. I think so. You know, there was a European presence. Miguel Martinos was there. The UN had sent folks, but I think that so you know there was an American presence overhanging things in a way because Bill Clinton had offered his ideas that the Israelis were urging should serve as parameters for the talks. So there was that influence, but yeah, I think there was greater intimacy somehow without the Americans, and because it's my sense that the Americans didn't play a constructive role at all in the year that led up to those talks. I think their absence maybe was constructive.
We just had on Professor Alan Dershowitz, and he said that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and that essentially they always walk away from a deal that's on the table. What do you say to that?
I think that it's patently untrue. I think that the Palestinians again and again have been prepared to accept sweeping concessions, not only the concessions that framed the peace process that began in 1993, accepting Israel on its 1948 borders, and thereby agreeing to the loss of the vast majority of what was Palestinian territory. And Palestinians at Camp David, at Taba, years later, in the negotiations that happened under the Bush administration, and in the negotiations that happened during the Obama administration, were prepared to accept concessions on settlements, on Jerusalem, on security, and on refugees. And each time it was Israel that was unwilling to go the extra mile to abide with the basic requirements of international law. And so while Palestinians, I think, have said there are certain minimum requirements that we can't move beyond and maintain our legitimacy with our public and achieve a sustainable deal, what they have never done is turned away from peace.
A lot of commentators have said that the leadership on both sides have used flare-ups in violence or even brought them about in order to dig them out of a hole domestically. Do you think that's true? And do you think that means that we're unlikely to ever see another, the peace process to arrive at another advanced stage as we saw in Taba?
I think that it is true to a certain extent that violence can serve to distract from very difficult coalition negotiations in Israel. It can serve to distract from the disastrous economic situation resulting from the blockade of Gaza. And so I think there are incentives for engaging in conflict. And I think that smart policy at the international level should undertake to create disincentives for those kinds of cycles. And that means holding leaders and governments more broadly to account for their breaches of obligations under international law. And that's what's so galling about the United States' current posture in this conflict. It seems unprepared to do that with respect to Israel, even as it's prepared to regard Hamas as bearing substantial legal and moral responsibility.
Omar Dajani, thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. Much appreciated.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for watching another episode of Nexus Extra. Do stay with us next week, another topic. Bye-bye. Well, thanks for watching our program. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends and family, and even subscribe.